In my past two videos, I covered how some of the most popular seafoods we eat have impacted our civilization, changed our history, economies, and culture. However, both of those two videos were covering the different types of fish we consume. In this video, I'm going to be covering aquatic invertebrates that we eat. What's so fascinating about this subject is that us humans, at least in Western cultures and many other cultures around the developed world, tend to shun the consumption of terrestrial invertebrates. We don't really eat insects such as crickets, and oftentimes consider them to be disgusting. In the eyes of many people, we are not particularly willing to eat arachnids such as spiders or scorpions in North America and Europe, and for that matter many other parts of the world. Yet nonetheless, the taboo is rather irrational, as we oftentimes love to eat aquatic invertebrates. Eating a cricket is not too different than, say, eating a crayfish, but for a variety of complex cultural reasons, many people are totally fine with eating shrimp but not crickets. In fact, the shrimp industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, whereas the cultivation and consumption of crickets is by and large a niche one. Before I start getting into some of the most popular types of aquatic invertebrates, I do want to point out that by and large, I'm going to be using the common names, not necessarily scientific terminology, but rather generic terms that we use to refer to these general groups of animals that we consume. Let's start off with lobsters. Lobsters are both a scientific category and a general marketing category. They're actually a family in and of themselves as far as scientific classification is concerned. However, oftentimes the meat you see labeled as lobster isn't necessarily lobster, and oftentimes isn't even part of the lobster family. Around much of Latin America, you may have heard of the slipper lobster on the menu. Slipper lobsters are not actually lobsters. Neither are spiny lobsters, which you are more likely to see in North America. Spiny lobsters belong to their own family. Even though they look quite similar to lobsters, these spiny lobsters are just poser lobsters, BS lobsters. They tend to be fished from the Caribbean and other warm tropical waters, in contrast to real lobsters, which by and large prefer temperate, cooler waters. If you go to a buffet, you are most likely to see spiny lobster referred to as langostras or rock lobster. This is because spiny lobsters live in warmer tropical climates in rocky areas that are likely to be fished from developing countries with cheaper labor and thereby are less expensive than their real lobster counterparts. Another factor that makes spiny lobsters cheaper is that real lobsters are not social. Real lobsters come from cool waters and tend to be more territorial and will cannibalize each other due to a lack of resources. And that's why they have to be placed in aquariums with rubber bands. But with spiny lobsters, you don't necessarily need to do this. On top of that, part of the reason why lobsters are generally speaking considered to be luxury food is because the logistics of managing them is rather difficult. See, if a lobster dies, within a period of 48 hours, it will develop harmful bacteria as they decompose. This is part of the reason why we tend to boil them alive, or boil them immediately after we kill them. One of the most common methods is by sliding a knife through the front of their heads. And while this may seem cruel, food poisoning is also very cruel. Keep in mind that we don't really know if crustaceans like lobsters are even capable of feeling pain, and there's some more research that needs to be done to better understand the ethical consequences. Wild lobster is oftentimes associated with status and success. After all, it's very expensive. However, for a period of time during the colonial New England era, much of the real lobsters were so abundant that they were actually considered to be the poor man's food, oftentimes fed to prisoners. They were considered giant sea cockroaches that were gross. In fact, they were considered so gross that giving prisoners too much lobster would be seen as a form of punishment, cruel and unusual punishment. However, as overfishing occurred, lobsters became more scarce. And with better cooking techniques, people came to the observation that they're actually really delicious, especially their tails. Lobster fishing plays a very important role in the economy and culture of New England and the Canadian Maritimes, with Maine lobster being the most prized type of lobster. Given the unique temperature that exists off the coast of the state of Maryland, its texture is considered to be a perfect medium due to its softness. It's not quite as tough as Canadian lobster, but not quite as soft as what you get in Massachusetts from what I've heard. Much of the high cost of lobster has to do with the aforementioned logistics, namely the fact that you have to eat them within a maximum of 2 days. Once they have been removed from the water, they are more likely to get you hospitalized, so be careful. Shipping live animals is obviously more of a hassle than shipping dead ones. Moving on to crabs. Crabs are a very complex group of animals, given the fact there are tons of animals that are oftentimes referred to as crabs that aren't really crabs. But you know what a crab is when you see one, right? Generally speaking, they have two pincers, a sort of oval shaped rounded body with an exoskeleton, 8 legs, you get the gist. They live in freshwater, brackish water, marine water, and sometimes even on land, depending on the species you're referring to. They are quite possibly one of the most remarkably successful groups of animals in the world, given that evolution has kept making crabs in various forms. There's even a term called crabification or carcinization. I'm going to use the term crabification, which is not the official term. The animals you may have heard of as being referred to as crabs oftentimes are not crabs. For example, hermit crabs and horseshoe crabs are not actual crabs. They are a product of crabification. One of the most common types of crabs that are eaten that are not real crabs is the king crab. King crab is a great example of crabification or carcinization, as they've evolved traits similar to true crabs. However, they're far more closely related to hermit crabs, which by and large are BS crabs. Nonetheless, people don't really care about the scientific classification of king crabs, they just care about them because their meat is tasty. What's quite remarkable about these poser crabs is that they've been accustomed to cold temperatures. Not just temperate waters like lobsters, but subpolar waters, oftentimes off the coast of Alaska and Siberia. This has led to a lucrative crabbing industry in Alaska. However, Alaskan crab fishermen holds the title as the most dangerous occupation in the US and quite possibly the world. The fatality rate of an Alaskan crab fisherman is higher than that of firefighters, police officers, soldiers, lumberjacks, and construction workers. A common type of crab that is actually a crab that is widely eaten and is far less likely to get you killed in the process of collecting them is native to the Atlantic, far warmer waters, and that is known as the blue crab. This crab is native to the waters of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico as well, where it's considered to be a seafood staple. The fishing industry, or crabbing industry as I should call it, for blue crabs has proven to be one of the most resilient in the world. The reason is that due to anthropomorphic climate change, we are seeing warmer temperatures around much of the eastern seaboard of the United States. And these crabs just so happen to love warmer temperatures, which means that they can more easily proliferate across much of the Atlantic coast. This has provided a great deal of livelihood for fishermen around these coasts. And given the fact that water here is not too deep and certainly isn't freezing, it's not likely to consume you or drown you. That makes the profession of crabbing for blue crabs far, far less deadly than that of Alaskan crabs. Next on the list are Dungeness crabs. These by and large are reserved for special occasions, similar to lobsters, as they're more expensive and more bulky. Part of the reason why they're more expensive is because they tend to require a certain degree of age and size in order to be edible. Many regional governments, namely state governments, have prohibited the catch of any of this crop that is less than a year old. Did I say crop? I meant catch. They're not wheat. The reason for these regulations is that they're there to ensure prosperous catches in the future, in order to make sure that the industry is sustainable. However, this has also led to higher costs for the consumer in the short run. Nonetheless, it has led Dungeness crab to be considered somewhat of a status symbol, similar to the aforementioned lobster. Let's move on to another iconic crustacean that is oftentimes eaten, and by and large is not quite as expensive, the crayfish, also known as crawdads, which are similar to lobsters, but in sharp contrast to lobsters, they reside in fresh or brackish bodies of water. And they're pretty damn hardy too, given the fact that they can live in stagnant water without a lot of gas exchange, which allows them to live in areas with poor water quality and low oxygen, as they love eating just about anything that's organic and decomposing, which makes them very common in estuaries, mangroves, and other shallow bodies of fresh and brackish water. This makes them particularly common in the southern United States, particularly the state of Louisiana, where they have become a culinary icon. However, much of the harvest of crayfish has suffered due to parasites and pathogens, given the fact that these critters tend to live in poor water quality. On top of that, much of their harvest is seasonal, making them fairly expensive. Another issue with harvesting and selling and buying crayfish is that they carry relatively little meat in comparison to their overall weight, primarily due to the excess weight coming from their exoskeletons. Unlike shrimp. We're not going to talk about seafood without talking about shrimp, which are arguably the most widespread form of seafood eaten around the world, given their small size, rapid reproduction, and the fact that they oftentimes lay a large number of eggs. On top of that, they're very hardy and adaptable to various temperatures, pH requirements, and even in certain cases, salinity. In certain ancient cultures, shrimp were actually prohibited from consumption, such as in the Book of Leviticus in the Bible, primarily because they're scavengers. Part of the reason for this is that they oftentimes ate scraps and detritus laying around the bedrock of these aquatic environments, and thereby were seen as dirty in the eyes of many humans. Nonetheless, they are an excellent cleanup crew in their aquatic environments that they live in, and an excellent source for other invertebrates, fish, seabirds, and a variety of other animals. Given the fact that they're found throughout much of the world in a variety of different climates and bodies of water, shrimp consumption is very common. The animals we refer to as shrimps, like the mantis shrimp or the brine shrimp, are actually not shrimp. Real shrimps are decapods. However, most shrimp that we eat in the supermarket or at restaurants are actually decapods, and thereby true shrimp. Moving on to a group of animals that, in my view, is quite possibly one of the most remarkable in the world, and one of the most criminally underrated in the world, and possibly shouldn't be eaten because of this reason, are the cephalopods. Cephalopods is a group of mollusks that includes octopus, squid, and cuttlefish. These are absolutely remarkable creatures, famed for their arms and or tentacles, their occasional ability to engage in camouflage and squirt ink, and most of all, their high degree of intelligence. They are a common food source for various cultures around the world, most notably in countries as diverse as Japan, South Korea, Spain, and Greece. It's not surprising that all of these countries that I mentioned have very strong maritime cultures. Due to better methods of refrigeration, freezing, and international logistical systems, cephalopods have now become quite popular as food sources for various people around the world, in places so far away from solid bodies of salt water. However, the consumption of cephalopods has also proven to be fairly controversial in recent years, given how much we've learned about their remarkable intellect. Now, let's move on to another group of organisms that are also mollusks, but in sharp contrast to cephalopods, are actually pretty dumb, like clams, oysters, and mussels. Clams are the most commonly fished animal in cooler waters, most notably off the coast of the eastern United States, such as New England, or for that matter, northwestern Europe. There are several species of clams, the most famous of which is the Atlantic surf clam. Another similar species are mussels. Mussels are bivalves, a mollusk distinct from its visual appearance from clams due to their darker color and longer shape. Common in the cuisines of southern European countries, they tend to prefer slightly warmer climates, such as those of the Mediterranean coast, where you can see pillars of these mollusks growing all over the so-called fish farms, or more accurately, mollusk farms. After all, mollusks are not fish. So long as the water conditions are right, and you have a hard surface for them to grow on, these filter feeders will proliferate. Another bivalve mollusk that are frequently farmed in similar manners are oysters. Oysters are some of the most popular luxury food items. However, they're also one of the most dangerous foods to eat, given the fact that they are oftentimes not prepared properly, and they can oftentimes lead to food poisoning. They're also famed for the production of pearls, which are even more expensive than their meat for obvious reasons. Animal rights activists and vegans, to some degree, have argued that the consumption of bivalves, such as mussels and oysters, are not necessarily wrong. After all, some of them could be considered part of a vegan diet. The reason being is that these animals, if you could call them that, do not have centralized nervous systems. They are not conscious. They do not have a brain, and they oftentimes act in a similar fashion to plants, simply reacting to stimuli, more like automatons than actual animals, and thereby are possibly, under some circumstances, ethical to eat in the eyes of vegans and other animal rights activists. And there you have it. That's my overview of some of the most common types of seafood humans consume. If you want to learn more about the world we live in, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my channel and like the video, or just downvote and leave a hate comment, something I can laugh at.